Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to thank all the speakers, actually, because I have found this an absolutely fascinating session from Lord Deeblen. I've never heard him speak before. I've heard a lot about him. I've seen one or two things, but I've never heard him speak before. And actually, he was very compelling. But every single one of the speakers, I think, today has illustrated something which is really interesting in their own way. So what is a soldier? I've done 10 operational tours, spent 2 years in Afghanistan, gone to Iraq and all that. What's a soldier doing standing here? I'm not even an engineer. I didn't have a clue about engineering apart from common sense. Well, I suppose it goes back to, I spent 4 years as the, I suppose you could call it global HR director for defense. Had about 3.5 million people I was responsible for in one form or another. It's 5% of the country's population. And I sat on what was called the Defence Executive Committee, which was the primary executive committee of defence, as it said, with the permanent secretary and the chief of defence staff as my bosses for 4 years. And not once in that 4 years was the words climate change or sustainability mentioned. And this is something I've been interested in for quite a long time. So I just turned around and said, you're not taking it seriously. You have no idea what it's going to do to you at all. Let me write you a report. And the answer I got back was, we're exempt climate change. And technically that's true. Defense does not need to report to the Kyoto Protocol. It is exempt. Soldiers would turn around to me and say, well, we just go and do what we're told by politicians. Doesn't matter. And I sort of, I objected to that a little bit because actually we do wear different kit if we go to the Arctic than we do if we go to the desert. So actually we do pay attention to our environment just a little bit. And then the last one was, what's the relevance when wars are being fought? And sadly, since I wrote this, a second, or the number of wars that's been declared has been doubled. And there's a point to that, but actually what the Russia-Ukraine war showed was that bombing Russian oil sites and their supply chains does an awful lot of good to the opposition. So, we've gone from that, where everybody was saying, you're barking, you're mad, you don't even bother talking about it. We're not going to pay any attention to your report anyway. But you know, if you have to, go and write it. Go on, be a little boy in the corner and write this report, which I did. To a senior champion in each command, so the Army, Navy, Air Force, the Strategic Command, a central piece, it's mentioned 68 times in the Defence Review, to NATO's Climate Change Action Plan is based on my report. 3 of their 4 are the 3 that I put out in our report. And the Pentagon, they produced a piece and they only quoted 3 references, and one of them was my report. So where did that change happen, and why did that change happen? Because I'm not actually a very good writer and I loathe writing. So it wasn't the report itself, probably. So I thought I'd put just sort of a couple of thoughts as to what happened and how I approached it. So the first one was working with the grain of the organization, not in the grain of the organization, is the way that I would sort of define it, or try and say what it is. Soldiers like science. They like to know why they're doing things. And so just, I mean, the common theme of this morning has been water. Whether it's utilities, whether it's floods and all the rest of it. And so I was fortunate enough to spend the last week in Italy at NATO's first climate change and security research workshop, where we had some really eminent climate change scientists. And one of them was talking about water. Why is it that more rain is falling, or more intense rainfall is falling? I was quoted when I produced my report as the general who insists we all have larger gutters round our houses, as a joke, but actually it's true. And there's a very good reason, as he described to. And I thought I'd just share it with you to try and explain, because I like to know why things are happening. And the simple answer is water and air react differently to increasing heat. Now, you might think that's entirely logical, but of course it does take a bit of thinking about. So with every 1 degree of heating, and actually on land, we're at about 1.5, 1.6 degrees at the moment. It is only the oceans that are keeping us under 1.5. 70% of the world's surface area is ocean. But for every 1 degree of heat, the oceans expire, i.e. water comes off the oceans at 2% more. But the air, 1 degree extra of heat, requires 7% more rain before it falls out of the sky with 1 degree of heat extra. So what you've got is this mismatch between 2% evaporation every 1 degree and 7% falling. So the hotter we get, the distance between rainfalls is going to get bigger by 3 times. So it's going to be more and more drought. And the amount of water, we're probably overland, there's 10% more rainfall falling each time. That is why the water utilities are having such a problem. And I'm not a particular fan of the water companies, I have to say. I'm along with 99% of the rest of the country, but they do have a point. Do have a point, which is they have 19th century technology, mostly in this country, against a massively 21st century problem, which is much, much more intense rainfall. Anyway, that was just one small thing. So soldiers like to know a bit about the science, but work with the organization. So what did I concentrate on in defense? I concentrated on defense on 2 things that really, really interest defense. The first is greater capability, being better at what we do, to be the best Army, Navy, and Air Force in the world. Really straightforward. So how does climate change affect our ability to be the best Army, Navy, and Air Force in the world? And I've repeatedly said we can be the greenest Navy, the greenest Air Force, and the greenest Army in the world, but if we come second in a war, we come second in a war. And that's not what we're paid to do. We're paid to come first. We're paid to win. We're paid to protect you. And therefore, there's no point in being green and less effective. You've got to be more effective and green. So that was the first thing I concentrated on. The second thing that defense, like every other government department, is interested in is money, saving money. So I had to put the whole of my plan about climate change into those 2 simple things. How do I save money? How do I make us more effective? And who should I be persuading? Not the Chief of Defence Staff, not the ministers. They're frankly irrelevant in defence. I shouldn't say that, but I did. Unlike most government departments, I should say. I had to persuade the finance director. So as a classic example, the Army wanted to put in some solar farms, and they said, we've got this idea for some solar farms. And the finance director said, why? He said, because we'll save lots of emissions. And he said, that's not our job. Go away. No money. None. Not even 5 million for a pilot project. And they came to me and said, oh, shit, excuse me. What do we do? So I said, well, you've just answered it in a completely, utterly the wrong way. So they went back to the finance director and said, we've got this really good idea, solar farms. And he said, why should we do that? So there's 2 reasons. One reason is the government has predicted that we will run out of electricity in this country on our current trajectory by 2035. Because if you make electricity pay for or be used for all our vehicles, all our heat, everything that we do will be electrified. We don't have enough, which is why the government is trying to push so much down nuclear, trying to push so much down offshore wind, or why they want to massively increase the renewables, because we're going to run out of electricity if everybody has a heat pump in their house. It's as simple as that. And so actually, if the Army ran out of electricity, it would be a little bit embarrassing. So it's about resilience. And the second reason is, of course, it saves money. There's an upfront cost, we accept that, but actually it saves money in the long run. And I'm now being paid because of the solar panels on my house. I happen to be being paid by the electricity companies. They probably hate me. Every year I make a massive profit. So it's about persuading the finance director, but the other person it's about persuading is the operator. So the way to persuade the operator is to turn around and say, and this is a sad statistic, but a number of statistics. First of all, the most senior British officer killed in Afghanistan was on a logistic patrol. He happened to be an infantryman, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Thornley, and he was killed leading his infantry battalion to protect fuel going to Helmand. So actually, not only is it a loss of life, which is tragic, that fuel, by the way, we think cost around about £200 a litre. more or less, to get to Helmand because of all the things you had to put on to make sure it got down the road to Helmand. And then you've taken away the infantry who should be fighting the Taliban just to protect fuel. So actually, if we can find a way of using less fuel by solar panels, by perhaps a micronuclear reactor, which Rolls-Royce is looking at, then actually, isn't that a better way of using our people? Isn't that a better way of using our equipment? So the operators got it immediately and said, we want some of this. We will go everywhere we can to try and make sure we reduce our fuel. And by the way, if you have enough electricity, and a micronuclear reactor will do this, you can create water. You can create sustainable aviation fuel. You can do all sorts of things if you have enough electricity. So as opposed to just diesel generators, we've gone for self-sustainability. And sort of finally in this sort of area, we've got electrification. I don't know how many of you have electric cars. I'm not going to ask for a sort of poll. I happen to have an electric car. I love driving it. It is the fastest car I've ever driven. It is just smooth as anything, and it's great fun. It also has 330 miles, which makes it really brilliant. But anyway, we've put electric drives in a lot of our vehicles. Now, we can't make an electric tank. It just doesn't exist. But we can put electric drives in with the diesel engine to fill the electric drive. Electric drives are far better. We can now do 360s in our tanks. We can now do 360s in any vehicle you care for. We can now go off-road far better than we used to be able to. The drivers say it's like driving a golf buggy, so they don't get into quite so many accidents. It's just better. And then you have, on the battery, a silent, completely silent mode, which means that the enemy can't find you. No emissions, no heat signature, no noise signature. So it's better tactically. That's what is a good thing for the MOD. So the first thing was work within the grain of the organization. Second is identify quick wins. Really, really straightforward. You've got to start somewhere. Don't put it off saying, oh, I haven't got all the things. Don't even worry. I would argue, and forgive me, I'm going to be very controversial here, don't even worry about having perfect data. Some companies will demand perfect data before they move at all. So no, don't worry about perfect data. Get on with it, and your data will come later, because you will learn more about how the data works if you just get on with it. So what are we doing with that? I said start with the estate, because the technology already exists. We've got 100,000 buildings in defense. To put that into perspective, we would have to make net zero 3,000 buildings a day, and it would take 100 years. Sorry, 3,000 buildings a week, and it would take 100 years to get all our buildings right. So this is a massive problem for us. But if you don't start, you'll never get there. So start on the estate. We joined the Jet Zero Council. The Royal Air Force has said that they're going to be net zero by 2040, and they're actively looking at sustainable aviation fuel. And the interesting thing about that is I turned around to them and said, you know what, the Royal Air Force doesn't use a huge amount of fuel compared to British Airways or Ryanair or something like that. And they turned around and said, that's fine. We may not have the volume, but we're government, we pay, and we've got reputation. So it's worth us doing it, because others will follow. And we now have 44 countries around the world following the Royal Air Force to get to net zero by 2040. That's the power of leadership, and that's what it's worth doing. And we built a green network in defense, harnessing the youth, harnessing those who are interested, and the power of the willing. And by building that green network, we encouraged and we supported. And the final thing is, I was always very worried about the fact that it was all about me. It was my report, I was driving it. I was actually asked to implement it, and I turned around and said, no, I'm not going to implement it. You gave me no support in writing it. You'll give me no support if you ask me to implement it. So I'm going to resign, which I did. And I said, but that's not the end of it. I want you to build a small team in defense to replace me. So 16 people in defense whose sole job is to do this. 16 out of 250,000, not very many. But actually their sole job as they work at departmental level is to keep ministers and to keep the senior civil servants on the button on keeping to net zero. The third thing is something that Lord Deben said very quickly, which was, I'll put a different phrase on it, it's been said before, use a sustainability lens in everything that you look at. And in a sense, the Lower Thames crossing is a fantastic example of using the sustainability lens in everything you look at. So the way that I did that is some what ifs. Working through digital twins. What if your supply chain had no access to oil anymore? What would you do differently? What would your supply chain do differently? Now, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be no oil. Just Stop Oil is not going to win this side of 2050 and probably not this side of 2070, in my view. But if you ask the question, what's going to happen if you took oil out of everything you did? What would you do to replace to keep your company going? What would you do to replace to keep your ideas going, your purpose going? Think about it, and you might come up with some really interesting solutions. And we came up with one. We built some near net zero transit accommodation. So for those on field exercises on Salisbury Plain, we built some near net zero buildings. There's a company called Reds 10. They're a wonderful construction company. And it was near net zero. And I went up to the managing director. I was there at the opening of them, all very successful, well done. And I said to him, having looked around, there's an awful lot of embedded carbon in this building. Do you think you could do better? And it was the sort of thing that senior officers say all the time, tend not to be noticed, and tend to sort of be oh, poor boy, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. But not this managing director. So I was asked to open the second lot of buildings up in a place called Nestcliff near Shrewsbury. And he bounded up to me, the managing director bounded up to me and said, we've reduced the embedded carbon by 1/3. And we did it by looking at every single material in this building and said, could we do it with less carbon? And of course, carbon is money, because embedded carbon is just the energy it requires to build that particular material. So he got rid of the steel basins and the steel loos. Why were they there? Oh, because soldiers don't know how to behave. Funnily enough, and put porcelain in, which is less carbon intensive. And guess what? Porcelain is cheaper because you can buy it down at B&Q. You can't buy a steel basin down at B&Q quite so easily. The whole building was so much cheaper that he put all the extra money, it was a fixed price contract, he put all the extra money into solar panels and into circulation systems in the building. What's the effect? It's now a net negative building. It gives back more than it takes. And there's no maintenance costs. There's no energy costs at all for that building. It was cheaper to go for better materials. So, and I'll give one other example. Water. We've been talking about water a lot. But if there is more water going to come down, and you use water in your systems, why don't you build a water tank as opposed to giving it all to the utilities to deal with in overflow? If every single house had a water tank and then used it, wouldn't that be better? But perhaps that's just me. But what we do is we look all the time in the MOD at new technologies, trying to get new technologies and understand what those new technologies offer us. And they won't all be relevant to the MOD, but they might just be relevant to our estate, and it's worth looking at it. So what's the result? We have a federated system in the MOD. Actually, the Army, Navy, and Air Force have all their own budgets. They now all have their own champions. They're all now going down a slightly different route. Does that matter? And I would argue that it's slightly incoherent, but it doesn't matter. So what's the best that can come from that? The best that can come from that is lots of ideas, enthused staff, initiative, and innovation. What's the worst that can come out of that? Well, it's not 100% efficient. Does that matter at this stage? And I would argue allowing people the freedom to do what they want to do is far better than top-down directed efficiency. I'll stop there.